How do you sort out the so-called jargon from real-world practices that work? Do the members of your organization find some business or technology advice utterly confusing? Welcome to Real Talk with Sam Holzman. In this program, we set the record straight, and in terms that business people and technology people can understand. Now, here is your host, Sam Holzman.
Welcome to this edition of Real Talk. I'm Sam Holzman. Thanks for joining me. And the topic of this particular broadcast is, how do you select an enterprise architecture methodology and framework and things like that? And for those of us that have been working in enterprise architecture, you know that's a challenge because it's a commitment for some time. And so what we put together some time ago is what we call a rating and evaluation handbook. And some of you may already have this, and that's fantastic. There's no cost for that at all. It has 26 categories all laid out for you with rating guides, 1 through 5, those types of things. Each one of those particular elements have a suggestion of what should be included in that particular section, et cetera, et cetera. So what I wanted to bring to our podcast audience is just a summary of that. To make this as useful as possible for you, please go to our website, www.eacoe.org, www.eacoe.org, and you will find literally hundreds of things that you can download at no cost. But specifically, what you'll be looking for is selecting an enterprise architecture methodology, a rating and evaluation handbook. And once again, what this has for you is these 26 distinct criteria to help you evaluate prior to spending your hard-earned dollars or your company's hard-earned dollars in an enterprise architecture approach. This guide has been downloaded literally tens of thousands of times, and I hope people have found it useful because it keeps getting incredible number of downloads. So again, we wanted to bring this to our podcast audience. Now, these 26 criteria are divided into 5 categories. What's the objectives that you're trying to achieve? The properties associated with each one of these, and we'll go over these just briefly in our podcast. The components required for each one of these elements, the functions that you need to do, and the services. And each criteria is presented in the form of a question, followed by a discussion to guide you in evaluating the methodology under review. And the handbook begins with a perspective-setting discussion on methodologies. And something that's very confusing to people is the difference between a methodology and a framework, and they're extremely different. And this is something that I think is inhibiting the incredible growth that we think should be there in enterprise architecture. It then introduces these 5 categories should you consider selecting a methodology. Now, what is a methodology once again? It's a recipe. It's not a general body of knowledge like an encyclopedia. It is a recipe. It is a guide to help you step 1, step 2, step 3. Now, also, a great methodology would allow flexibility in that, but it will give you out of the box, so to speak, a guide to get you an outstanding enterprise architecture for your organization. Each category contains a specific criteria that you can look at. Each category is a discussion area, so you can sort of see underneath what's there. And the handbook concludes with a chart that you can use to make quantitative evaluations and comparing the methodologies. So the sections that we're talking about, just briefly, again, the 26, I'm going to go over those briefly in our podcast. Again, please go to our website to download the actual guide. Starts off with the objectives of the guide. Centralized, decentralizes approaches for enterprise architecture. The simplification that you need to actually incur a good enterprise architecture. And this includes taking things that are very complex and making them easier to understand. And so we recognize that organizations are very complex, but in order to really understand them, you have to take them apart into its pieces that's there. And the concept of standardization, in other words, a methodology, a recipe that is consistent in the organization. What are the properties of a good methodology? There's a bunch of these. Customizability, correctness. Can you prove actually that it will produce something that is accurate? Compatibility with you and your organization that's there. Completeness from beginning to middle to the end. And of course, what's the output of enterprise architecture? A series of initiatives that help the organization achieve its objectives. That's really the objective of a good enterprise architecture methodology. Concise, no entropy, no waste there, minimum things that you need to do, not maximum. Again, the difference between an encyclopedia that has everything in the universe versus an outstanding methodology that has a direct sequence of events that you need to do. And of course, you can augment those and change them. Subsetting, how do you take this thing apart into pieces? What are the deliverables that need to be there? What are the methods, the processes, the methods you need, the techniques that are there, the standards associated with this, the roles and responsibilities of the various individuals in enterprise architecture, the tool concepts that are there, and the different paths that you can use to move forward. Within that, 2 more sections, an area on functions. How do you manage the methodology? How do you navigate through this? How do you put together a guide for yourselves and your stakeholder? We call that a handbook. And what are the interfaces for things that you need for various tools and techniques and presentation activities and things like that? Associated with all of this, you may need some guidance. We call that the services area. Is there education that you can have for yourself and your stakeholders? Integration with the tools that you have now? Demonstration. Is there a concept there where you can demonstrate the enterprise architecture methodology in a relatively short period of time so other people can sort of see what real enterprise architecture is all about? And finally, how do you actually implement the results that are there? So hopefully this will help. Once again, this is just a summary of the concepts that we talk about in this handbook. The handbook is neutral. Yes, we have put it together, and obviously we believe the EACOE Enterprise Architecture Center of Excellence is the best practice and the industry standard. Of course, it's our opinion because we put the guidebook together. We don't rate ourselves, by the way. It's all blank because we want you as the stakeholders to do this. And of course, there's columns there for the various types of methodologies you may be looking at. Once again, www.eacoe.org, selecting an enterprise methodology, a rating and evaluation handbook. Hopefully you'll find it useful, as tens of thousands of other people have. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for tuning in to Real Talk. Be sure to join your host, Sam Holzman, again for another edition of our program. We'll have more real topics of discussion then.